About 5 months ago, I walked away from my husband, Mike. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but I had reached my breaking point. Mike had been formally diagnosed with severe depression earlier that year, though honestly, I had suspected for months that something was wrong. He was drowning in regret and sorrow, mainly over two people from his past: his ex-girlfriend, Rachel, and his childhood best friend, Jake. Both of them had been incredibly important to him, and losing them had completely shattered him. Here's the backstory. Before Mike and I ever got together, he and Rachel had been in a serious relationship for years. They were young, in love, and from what he told me, they'd been inseparable. Then one day, out of nowhere, Rachel cheated on him. With Jake, of all people. Jake wasn't just some random guy. He was like a brother to Mike. The betrayal hit like a wrecking ball, destroying two of the closest relationships he had in one swift blow. After that, Mike didn't date for a long time. He told me he just could not bring himself to trust anyone. He needed years to process the pain and figure out how to move forward. By the time I met him, it seemed like he had finally made peace with it. Or at least he was trying to. The wounds were still there, though, making him hesitant to fully open up. We dated for 4 incredible years, going through all the highs and lows that come with being in love. Eventually, we got married. Our wedding was beautiful, family, friends, so much love in one room. It was the kind of day that felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. And honestly, for a while, it really was. Mike was an amazing partner in the early years of our marriage. He was supportive, kind, and deeply thoughtful. We built a life together that I thought was solid, something we could lean on through anything. But then, earlier this year, everything changed. Rachel and Jake were killed in a car accident. Together. The news hit Mike like a freight train. For years, he had carried anger and resentment toward them. But now, they were gone. And all that anger seemed to dissolve into grief. The loss was sudden, permanent, and brought up all the pain he had buried. He was consumed by regret, wishing he had confronted his feelings, forgiven them, or at least had one final conversation. He told me how much he wished he could have spoken his truth, how sorry he was that he never made peace with what happened. He carried that guilt like a weight strapped to his chest, and knowing he'd never get closure seemed to crush him. I did my best to comfort him, reminding him that it was okay to grieve and that feeling regret did not make him a bad person. But the more I tried to help, the more he seemed to pull away. Mike couldn't forgive Jake, even though Jake had reached out multiple times over the years, trying to make amends. He had apologized repeatedly, wanting to rebuild the friendship they had destroyed. But Mike could not bring himself to move past it. And honestly, I do not blame him. How do you forgive your best friend for sleeping with the person you loved? Even with all the apologies in the world, some wounds are just too deep to heal easily. I tried to comfort him as best as I could, reminding him that what happened was not his fault. I told him he had every right to protect himself from being hurt again. But no matter what I said, it never seemed to help. The guilt and pain consumed him, and his grief began to spiral into something darker, something heavier. Mike would spend hours lying in bed, barely moving. Some days, he would lose himself in video games, disappearing into that world for hours. Other times, he would just sit there, staring blankly at the wall with a beer in his hand. He stopped caring about work, often calling in sick or just not showing up at all. Eventually, he got fired, which left me as the only one bringing in money to keep us afloat. I could see him slipping away, and I tried everything to help. I suggested small outings, simple things like taking a walk or grabbing coffee, anything that might lift his spirits, even just a little. But no matter what I said, it was like my words never reached him. He had no motivation to try, no desire to pull himself out of the darkness. As Mike sank deeper into his depression, his behavior started to change in ways that made it even harder for me to reach him. His moods became unpredictable. Some days, he was irritable, snapping at me over the smallest things. Other days, he shut down completely, retreating into himself like a shell of the man I had married. On top of not working, Mike stopped helping around the house. I was left juggling everything: cleaning, cooking, bills, work, and it felt like I was carrying the weight of two lives, not just my own. Meanwhile, I was watching the man I loved drift further and further away. Even then, I held on to hope. I thought maybe we could still come out of this together, that the man I had fallen in love with was still in there somewhere. But things only got worse. Mike became paranoid and controlling. If I stayed out late, whether it was for work or just grabbing drinks with friends to decompress, he would wait for me, sitting on the couch when I walked through the door. His eyes would bore into me as he bombarded me with questions. Why were you out so late? Who were you with? No matter how honestly I answered, he would always find a way to twist it, hinting that he did not believe me. Sometimes, he would even accuse me outright, as if I was the one betraying his trust instead of trying my hardest to hold everything together. Mike's accusations became worse. He started throwing out wild claims that I was cheating on him with my coworkers or even my friends, saying that was the reason I was out of the house so often. Hearing these baseless accusations was beyond painful. It was insulting. I tried to reassure him, over and over, that I would never betray him, but it was like talking to a brick wall. He refused to believe me. The arguments became intense and exhausting. He started demanding that I come straight home after work, no exceptions. Even on weekends, he insisted that I stay home with him, as though my time no longer belonged to me. It was suffocating. The space I used to feel in our marriage, the sense of freedom and partnership, was gone, replaced by his anger and insecurities. Then things took an even darker turn. Mike's frustration started showing itself in physical ways. There were two moments that still make my stomach churn when I think about them. The first was during one of our arguments. He lost his temper and punched the wall, right above my head. The sound of his fist slamming into the wall was deafening, and it left me feeling rattled and afraid. The second moment was even worse. During another heated fight, he slapped me. The force of it made me stumble, and I was left standing there, stunned. Mike is a much bigger man than me, and in that moment, I realized just how dangerous the situation had become. His grief and depression had morphed into something I never thought I would have to face. A level of aggression that left me feeling completely unsafe. That was my breaking point. I could not stay in a marriage where my well-being, or even my life, felt at risk. So, I packed my bags. As I stood by the door, ready to leave, Mike broke down. He pleaded with me not to go, promising again and again that he would change. I held my ground and told him that if there was any chance of me staying, he would have to take real, meaningful steps to get help. He agreed, saying he would see a doctor if it meant saving our marriage. Reluctantly, I decided to give it one last try. It was not an easy decision, and doubt was gnawing at me the entire time. But I wanted to believe that the man I had fallen in love with was still in there somewhere, waiting to come back to me. That is when Mike was formally diagnosed with severe depression. He was put on medication and started seeing a therapist weekly. He even began meditating to help control his anger. Slowly, I noticed small but meaningful changes in him. The medication seemed to stabilize his mood, and he started making a real effort to be present and contribute around the house. Little by little, I saw glimpses of the person he used to be, the man I had married. It gave me hope, a fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. Mike started showing more effort to reconnect, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of relief. Maybe, just maybe, with time and effort, things could improve between us. But there was still one major issue hanging over our heads: his refusal to go back to work. Since his diagnosis, Mike had not held a single job. While I did not mind being the one to provide financially, I wanted him to at least try. Every time I brought it up, encouraging him to consider something part-time or even a remote job he could do from home, he shut me down. His answer was always the same: I feel too weak, too low to commit to anything right now. This disagreement became a frequent source of tension between us, and eventually, it led to full-blown arguments. I felt torn. On one hand, I knew he was struggling and trying to heal, but on the other hand, the financial strain and his refusal to even explore options left me feeling frustrated and isolated. It was like I was carrying the weight of our entire life on my shoulders, and he was not even willing to meet me halfway. Then, last month, Mike surprised me. He suggested that we try couples counseling. He said that with everything we had been going through, he thought it might help us communicate better and work through some of the issues that were holding us back. He had already done the legwork, reached out to a counselor and made an appointment. All I had to do was show up. I agreed, hoping that therapy might be the push we both needed to heal and reconnect. I also thought maybe a counselor could help Mike find the encouragement and support he needed to take those first steps toward rebuilding his life. But I never could have predicted what happened next. To put it simply, couples counseling made things worse. A lot worse. In our sessions, Mike started opening up in ways he never had before, and what he shared cut me to my core. He admitted that a significant part of his depression came from the life we had built together. He felt like marriage had buried him under a pile of responsibilities, forcing him to live a life he never really wanted. And then he dropped a bombshell. He still missed his ex, Rachel. He confessed that, even after all these years, he sometimes wished Jake had not stolen her from him. Hearing him talk about Rachel like that was like a slap to the face. He admitted that he had never fully healed from the betrayal, that losing her, and Jake, had left a hole in his life that he did not know how to fill. He said that he often felt like he had missed out on the life he was supposed to have, and that regret weighed on him every single day. The more he talked, the more I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. It was as if I had been standing on the sidelines of his life all along, watching him mourn a past that had nothing to do with me. Mike told me something in counseling that left me reeling. He admitted that he felt like he had rushed into our marriage, that he had never taken the time to enjoy being single or figure out what he truly wanted for himself after the heartbreak of losing Rachel. I was stunned. I reminded him, firmly but calmly, that he was the one who proposed to me. We had dated for years before getting married. How could he possibly feel like he was rushed into this? The counselor interrupted before I could go further, encouraging Mike to speak his truth, even if it hurt my feelings. That stung, but I bit my tongue and let him keep talking. Over the next few sessions, Mike started revealing more, and every word felt like a dagger. He told me, right there in front of the counselor, that he wanted a chance to redo his single life. And since we were already married, he suggested that we could find a compromise. He asked if I would allow him to see other people while staying married to me. I laughed, hoping it was some sort of horrible, misguided joke, but he was dead serious. Mike argued that he deserved to experience both lives, the single life he felt he missed out on and the stability of marriage. He said it was only fair that he get the chance to explore and find himself before it was too late. I was appalled, absolutely disgusted. I did not hold back in telling him just how hurtful and ridiculous his suggestion was. I told him flat out that if he wanted to live like a single man, I could make that happen by leaving the marriage entirely. There was no way I was going to stay in a relationship where I was expected to remain loyal while he got to fool around with strangers. My words struck a nerve. Mike's face twisted in anger, and he shot back, claiming that I could never understand how he felt. He said that, unlike him, I had been with multiple people before we got together, so I could not possibly relate to what he was going through. I was floored. The audacity of him trying to use my past against me was infuriating. I calmly reminded him that I had only been in 2 serious relationships before him, both meaningful, committed partnerships that simply did not work out. My experiences did not make me less entitled to expect faithfulness in our marriage. I told him that if he wanted to live the single life so badly, he should have thought about that before he proposed, before we walked down the aisle, before we built a life together. I reminded him of all the sacrifices I had made for our relationship, especially in the last year. I had been the one keeping us afloat, supporting him financially and emotionally while he wrestled with his depression. I told Mike that I had supported him through everything, because I believed in him, in us, and in our marriage. But now, he was asking for something unreasonable, something that completely undermined the commitment we had made to each other. It felt like he wanted the love and stability I provided without honoring the responsibility that came with it. I made it clear that he could not have it both ways. He needed to make a choice, either a committed life with me or a single life without me. But I was not going to let him keep me in limbo, expecting me to bend to his whims while he kept one foot out the door. Since that confrontation in front of the counselor, Mike has been sulking around the house, acting as if I am the one being unreasonable. He keeps trying to convince me that I am being harsh, even selfish, for refusing to let him have some fun. He insists that if I truly loved him, I would be more open-minded and supportive of his need to explore. It is infuriating. His attempts to guilt me into agreeing only reinforce the fact that he still does not understand, or refuses to understand, how hurtful, disrespectful, and unfair his request is. But I am standing firm. I have tried to be patient, compassionate, and supportive throughout the highs and lows of his depression, but there are boundaries I will not compromise on. I told him flat out that being open-minded does not mean sacrificing my own self-respect or the integrity of our marriage. I refuse to let him manipulate me into believing I am in the wrong. So, Reddit, am I the bad guy for refusing to let my husband see other people while we are still married? For those of you asking if Mike might already be cheating and just using this as a way to justify his behavior, honestly, I do not think that is the case. My husband barely leaves the house. He spends most of his time either playing video games or lost in his own thoughts. Ironically, if he were having an affair, at least I would have clarity, a clean-cut reason to walk away. Yes, it would hurt, but at least I would know he had already moved on without me. Instead, I am stuck dealing with this painful, confusing situation. As for why Mike has been so deeply affected by Rachel and Jake's deaths all of a sudden, I do not fully know. My best guess is that it was a reality check for him. Losing two people he had known so well, and so unexpectedly, might have triggered something in him, a spiral he was not prepared to deal with. But honestly, I am not entirely sure. I have never fully understood why Rachel and Jake's deaths hit Mike so hard enough to drag him into this downward spiral, and I certainly cannot understand why he thinks wrecking our marriage and sleeping around will somehow fix his depression. One commenter on my last post suggested something that has been haunting me ever since. Maybe Mike never truly loved me. Maybe he saw me as a safety net, someone reliable and loyal to fall back on after Rachel betrayed him. Maybe he liked the stability I provided but never let go of his feelings for her. Perhaps, now that she is gone, he regrets not giving things another shot with her when he had the chance. Whatever the case, the idea of an open relationship feels like a complete betrayal of everything we built together. I am deeply committed to monogamy. If Mike had ever hinted that he wanted something like this, I would never have married him. This sudden shift in what he wants from our relationship feels like it came out of nowhere, like he has thrown away the life and values we worked so hard to create. The only reason I have not left him already is because I genuinely worry about his mental health. Mike has been my partner for so long, and for years it felt like it was just the two of us against the world. He was never like this before. He was never cruel or selfish. He never raised his voice at me, let alone his hand. When he started to change so drastically after the accident, I told myself it was just a phase. I wanted to believe that the man I fell in love with was still in there somewhere, buried under all the grief and pain. I hoped that, with time and support, he would find his way back to himself and to us. But now I see that I cannot keep waiting for a version of him that may never return. I have finally accepted that it is time to choose myself. This marriage is over. It has been 2 weeks since my last update. I decided to take the next step and reached out to a lawyer in private to begin the divorce process. Mike and I own our home together, and we share a joint bank account. Given that he is still unemployed and our financial situation is already tight, I needed to protect myself and my assets before filing any paperwork. My lawyer walked me through the steps to ensure I would be in the best position possible. Once everything was finalized on my end, I began preparing myself for the difficult conversation ahead. I knew breaking the news to Mike would not be easy. Then, yesterday, Mike crossed a line I could no longer ignore, and I realized I could not keep quiet any longer. We were at his sister's house for a family lunch. His family has always been kind to me, and I have a good relationship with them, so I was genuinely looking forward to catching up with everyone. For context, his family knows we have been struggling in our marriage, but they do not know the full story. During lunch, I noticed Mike was drinking. This immediately set off alarm bells for me, because his medication for depression makes it dangerous for him to drink alcohol. Seeing him pour himself a glass of whiskey made me uneasy. I gently tried to bring it up, asking him if he should be drinking, but he just scoffed at me, ignored my concern, and kept going. I felt disrespected, but I decided to leave him alone and let him do what he wanted. As the meal went on, everyone was chatting about their lives. At some point, Mike's mom turned to me and asked how things were going with us and how my work was going. I told her we had been attending couples counseling and mentioned that Mike still had some things to work through. Then, I started sharing updates about my job. That was when Mike interrupted me with a comment that stopped me in my tracks. He said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, that his depression would be cured much faster if his wife understood what he really wanted in life. His mom looked confused and asked him what he meant by that. And that is when Mike, in front of his entire family, declared that I was the reason his life was so miserable. The room fell silent. Everyone stopped eating and just stared at him. It was obvious by then that he was drunk. Mike kept going. He said I refused to give him what he wanted and claimed I was nothing but a conservative, insecure, and possessive wife who was making him feel suffocated. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He was twisting the story completely, shifting all the blame onto me. His words were humiliating, and I felt betrayed sitting there as he aired our personal struggles in front of his family, making me out to be the villain. Mike's sister, who I have always been close to, immediately jumped in and asked him why he was talking about me like that. She looked furious with him. The rest of his family just sat there in stunned silence, clearly uncomfortable and unsure of what to say. But Mike did not stop. He kept talking, saying that all he wanted was one small thing from me, and I refused to give it to him purely out of my stubbornness. That was it for me. I snapped. Hearing him try to paint me as the bad guy, especially after everything I had done to support him, was too much to bear. Mike's words were so hurtful, I could not hold back anymore. I turned to him and demanded to know why he was not being honest with his family, why he was not telling them the whole truth about what he really wanted from me. Then, with all the frustration and pain I had been bottling up for months, I told his family exactly what Mike had asked of me. I told them how he wanted to explore other relationships, which, let us be honest, was just a polished way of saying he wanted to sleep around with strangers while expecting me to stay loyal and devoted to him. I explained how he expected me to continue being the supportive wife, holding our life together, while he lived a carefree, unburdened existence. I laid it all out, every raw, unfiltered detail. The room went silent. His family looked absolutely stunned. His mother, visibly shaken, asked him if that was really what he had been asking of me. His father, who had always been kind and respectful toward me, shook his head in disbelief before scolding Mike. He asked if Mike had completely lost his mind. But Mike, instead of apologizing, doubled down. He tried to justify himself. He said that every marriage goes through a stalemate and that his solution would help fix things between us. He called it temporary, insisting that I should actually feel lucky that he was being honest and asking for my permission. He even had the audacity to say that most men would just cheat behind their wives' backs, so I should be grateful he was respectful enough to involve me in the discussion. That was it. That was my breaking point. I yelled at him, telling him I was sick of his selfishness, his excuses, and his constant attempts to justify this ridiculous, hurtful behavior. I told him I was done. Right there, in front of everyone, I announced that our marriage was over. I said I could not keep fighting for something that he clearly did not value anymore. Then, I looked him straight in the eye and told him I would be sending him divorce papers. His face was a mix of shock and disbelief. He just stared at me, blinking slowly, as if he could not process what was happening. I pulled out the business card my lawyer had given me, handed it to him, and told him that if he wanted to discuss anything about the divorce, he could talk to my lawyer. Then I added, for good measure, that I would be moving out that very day. Mike's parents were understandably concerned. They tried to console me, telling me that maybe Mike was only acting this way because of his medication, that he probably did not fully realize what he was saying or doing. They seemed desperate to excuse his behavior, chalking it up to a temporary lapse caused by his depression or the drugs he was taking. But I was done making excuses for him. I told them point blank that their son had been dragging me down for months. Depression or not, he had crossed too many lines. I had waited and hoped for long enough. There was no more waiting, no more hoping. I had given everything I had to this marriage, and in return, Mike had disrespected me over and over again. This time, I decided I was done. I was going to put myself first. Mike tried to argue, his voice timid and uncertain, saying that I could not just walk out of our marriage over something as silly as this. He insisted we should go back to counseling to work through our issues. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head at his suggestion. Mike, I told him, you absolutely need a counselor, but I do not. I am not the one acting recklessly, making selfish demands, or blaming my partner for my own bad choices. I made it crystal clear that I was not going to waste another second trying to fix a marriage that I no longer wanted to fix. Without saying another word, I walked out of his sister's house and headed straight to our home. By the time I got home, arriving in an Uber, calling out my name like a man possessed, I had already packed my bags and was ready to leave. He immediately resorted to the same tired begging routine. He pleaded with me, saying we could still work through this hiccup in our marriage. At one point, he even tried grabbing onto my luggage to stop me from walking out. That was when I drew the line. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that if he so much as tried to stop me, I would call 911 and make the divorce process even harder for him. I asked him firmly, but clearly, to let me go. Begrudgingly, he released his grip and stepped aside. I quickly gathered my things and left to stay at a motel. Thank you to everyone who left comments on my last update. Reading your words has helped me feel stronger and more confident in my decision. Ever since that day, I have been staying in a motel. It is not glamorous, but it is mine. Mike, of course, has not stopped trying to contact me. He has been bombarding me with voicemails. One moment accusing me of being heartless and saying I am ruining everything, and the next, apologizing profusely and telling me how sorry he is for what he has done. It has been a non-stop emotional roller coaster. But the more I hear from him, the clearer it becomes that he is just trying to manipulate me, playing on my emotions to get me to reconsider. At this point, I am not giving in. His words do not change the fact that I made my decision based on the person he has become. I refuse to go back to the way things were. I am done with excuses and empty promises. It is time for me to focus on moving forward and healing from everything that has happened. To clear up any confusion, let me be absolutely clear. I am not leaving my ex because of his depression. I have a deep respect for people who struggle with mental health conditions. Depression is a serious and often debilitating battle, and I would never want to minimize that. But when it comes to my relationship with Mike, I am exhausted. He has continually used his depression as a shield, an excuse to demand whatever he wants from me without considering how unfair that is. I gave everything I had to support him, but there comes a point when no single person can carry the entire weight of a relationship alone. Since leaving him, I have felt so much lighter. I have been able to focus on myself for the first time in years, and being away from him has eased the constant anxiety I was living with. It is heartbreaking to end my marriage, but I know I had to walk away for the sake of my own mental and emotional health. It has been 5 months since my last update. I did not share anything sooner because nothing was finalized, until now. Mike and I are officially divorced, and I can finally say I am a free woman. We split the proceeds from selling our house equally. Thankfully, we did not have any major liabilities or children, so there were no alimony payments to deal with. Getting to this point was not easy. There were countless moments when Mike and his family tried everything in their power to convince me to stay. They clung to this idea that somehow things could go back to normal. Mike's mom, in particular, was relentless. She came to see me several times after I moved out, always siding with her son during the divorce proceedings. She constantly tried to guilt me into staying, saying that Mike needed a supportive partner like me and that it was my duty to honor our marriage vows. At first, I tried to be polite. I tried reasoning with her, explaining why I could not stay. But as her visits continued, I started to lose patience with her approach. Finally, during one of her visits, I decided to be brutally honest. I told her the truth, that Mike had once slapped me during an argument and that I should have left him right then and there. I looked her in the eye and asked, if your husband had ever done that to you, would you have stayed? I told Mike's mom everything. I laid it all out, how I had given everything I had to our marriage, stayed even though Mike did not deserve my forgiveness, and endured more than anyone should have to. When I told her that Mike had once slapped me during an argument, she was completely stunned. The look on her face said it all. After that, she never came back to bother me again. During the divorce proceedings, I noticed that Mike had spiraled even deeper into his depression. Honestly, He looks worse than he did before. I can only hope his family steps up and gets him the help he clearly needs. Mike's sister is the only one who believes I made the right choice by leaving him. She has been incredibly supportive, and we have stayed friends through all of this. As for me, I have finally moved into a place of my own. And honestly, it feels amazing. Being a newly divorced woman feels liberating. I am proud of myself for trusting my instincts and choosing to leave a toxic relationship before it could drag me down any further. Now, I wake up when I want. There is no one to answer to, no one waiting to pull me back into their darkness. I can focus entirely on my career without distractions. I spend time with my friends and coworkers without guilt. I come and go as I please, and that freedom is something I have not felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I am living for myself again. I no longer have the weight of someone else's sadness, demands, and excuses holding me back. And that feeling, that freedom, it is worth everything.